Once upon a time, 3 little maidens were lost in a great forest. It was beginning to get dark when they spied a small light coming from a house. So the youngest of them, who was called Molly Whuppie, and was by far the cleverest and pluckiest, went and knocked at the door. A woman came to the door and said, "What do you want?" Molly Whuppie answered, "We are lost. Please let us rest for a while and give us something to eat." "Eat? Eat?" said the woman. "Why, my husband's a great giant. Soon as say scat, he'd eat you. Now go away quickly." But they were tired out and famished, and Molly begged the woman to let them in. So at last she did take them in and gave them some bread and milk. Just then there came a thumping at the door. It was the giant come home. "Fee-fi-fo-fum, I smell the blood of some earthly one." "Aye," he growled, squinting at the children. "What is it we have here?" "3 poor, tired, hungry, lost little lasses," said his wife. "Get to your supper, my man, and leave them alone." So the giant sat down to his supper and said nothing. But between bites, he looked at the children. Now the giant had 3 daughters of his own, and the giant's wife put all 6 children into the same bed, for thus she thought she would keep the little visitors safe from harm. But before he went to bed, the giant hung chains of gold around his daughters' necks and chains of yellow straw around Molly's and her sisters' necks. Soon the other 5 were fast asleep, but Molly lay awake listening. Then she rose up quietly and changed the necklaces. So now Molly and her sisters wore the chains of gold, and the giant's 3 daughters the chains of straw. In the middle of the night, the giant came tiptoeing into the room. He plucked up out of the bed the 3 children with the straw necklaces around their necks and locked them up in his great dungeon. "So, my pretty ducklings," he smiled to himself as he bolted the door. "Now I have you safe. Ha, ha, ha!" When all was still again, Molly awakened her sisters and whispered, "Come with me." Then they tiptoed out into the forest and never stopped running till morning, when they came to another house. It had 1,000 windows and stood beside a pool of water full of wild geese. It was the house of a king. So Molly went in and told her story to the king. The king, who knew the giant of old, listened, and when Molly had finished, he said, "Well, Molly, you have done well. You have done very well. But you'd do better still if you would go back and get for me the giant's sword that hangs behind his bed. If you do that, I will give my first son for a husband to your first sister, and then your sister will be a princess." Molly looked at the eldest prince, and she liked his looks, so she smiled and said, "I'll try." So that very same evening, she muffled herself up and made her way back through the forest to the house of the giant. First, she listened under the window, and there she heard the giant eating his supper. So she quietly crept into the house and hid herself under his bed. In the middle of the night, the rafters trembled with the giant snoring as Molly climbed cautiously up onto the great bed and unhooked the giant's sword that was hanging from a nail in the wall. Luckily for Molly, this was not the giant's huge battle saber, but only a little sword. Nevertheless, it was heavy enough, and when she came to the door, the sword rattled in its sheath and woke up the giant. Then Molly ran, and the giant ran, and they both ran, and she ran, and he ran, and she ran, and he ran, and she ran, and he ran, and at last they came to the bridge of the single hair. And Molly was so light she could run over. But not the giant, for run over he could not. Instead, he shook his fist at her and shouted across the great chasm, "Woe betide you, Molly Whuppie, if you e'er return again." But Molly only laughed, saying, "Maybe twice I'll come and see ye, if so be I come to Spain." Then Molly carried the sword to the king, and her eldest sister was married to the king's eldest son. "Well," said the king after the wedding was over, "that was well done, Molly. That was very well done. But you do better still if you would bring to me the purse that lies under the giant's pillow. If you'll do that, Molly, I'll marry your second sister to my second son." Molly looked at the king's second son, and she liked his look. So she smiled and said, "I'll try." So she dressed herself in a different colored coat and made her way stealthily through the forest to the giant's house. And there he was, gulping down his supper. This time she hid herself in his clothes closet, and a stuffy place that was. About the middle of the night, she stole out of the clothes closet over to the giant's bed, and taking a deep breath, she slipped her hand just a little way under his pillow. The giant stopped snoring and grunted, and Molly held her breath. But soon the giant began to snore again. Then Molly slipped her hand still further under the giant's pillow. At this, the giant called out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" And his wife said, "Easy, man, be quiet. You ate too many big bones for supper." When all was peaceful again, Molly moved her hand in a little bit further till she touched the purse. But as she pulled it out, a gold piece clanked to the floor. At the sound of it, the giant roused from his sleep. Then Molly ran, and the giant ran, and they both ran. And she ran, and he ran, and she ran, and he ran, and she ran, and he ran, till they came to the bridge of a single hair. Molly got over, but the giant stayed, for get over he could not. Then he cried out to her across the chasm, "Woe betide ye, Molly Whuppie, if you e'er return again." But Molly only laughed and called back to him, "Once again I'll come and see, if so be I come to Spain." So she took the giant's purse to the king, and her second sister married his second son, and there were great rejoicings. "Well, well," said the king, "you have done well, Molly. You have done very well. But you can do better still. Bring to me the giant's ring from off his thumb, and you shall have my youngest son for yourself. And Molly, he's the best of all." Molly laughed and looked at the king's youngest son, turned her head, frowned a little, smiled a little, for she liked his looks. So she said, "I'll try." This time, when she had crept into the giant's house, she hid in the chimney corner. When the giant was sound asleep, she stepped out of the chimney corner and crept towards the bed. By good chance, the giant's hand was hanging down outside the bed, and there was the great thumb that wore the ring. She pulled and tugged at it softly. Little by little it slid down till it came to the knuckle bone, and when Molly pulled it over the last joint, it dropped into her hand as the giant awoke and grabbed her. "Aha," says he, "now I have you, Molly Whuppie, and what shall I do with you? If you were me and I were you, what would you do with me?" "Well," said Molly, who was very nimble-witted, "I'd put you into a big cloth bag, put the cat and the dog into the bag with you, and a needle and thread, and a great pair of scissors, and I'd hang you up on the bedpost. Then I'd get the heaviest club I could find and whack you until I had beaten you to a jelly. That's what I'd do." "And that, Molly," says the stupid giant, "that's just what I will be doing with you." So the giant rose up out of his bed and fetched a bag, put Molly into it, and the cat and the dog besides, and a needle and thread and a stout pair of scissors, and hung her up on the bedpost. Then went into the forest to get him a good strong stick. When he was well gone, Molly, stroking the dog with one hand and the cat with the other, sang out in a high, clear voice, "Oh, if you could see what I see." "See, Molly Whuppie," said the giant's wife. "What do you see?" But Molly only said, "Oh, if you could see what I see." Then the giant's wife begged and entreated Molly to let her into the bag so that she could see what Molly saw. At last she said, "Let me get into that bag, Molly Whuppie." So Molly took the scissors and cut a hole in the lowest corner of the bag, jumped out, helped the giant's wife up into it, and as fast as she could, sewed up the hole with the needle and thread. But it was pitch black in the bag, so the giant's wife saw nothing, and she soon began to ask to be let out again. "Molly Whuppie, you let me out of this bag." Molly never heeded or answered, but hid herself behind the door. Home at last came the giant, with a big club in his hand and a knob on the end of it as big as a pumpkin, and he began to whack the bag with the club. "Arr, arr, arr, arr," barked the dog. "Arr, arr." "Meow, meow," squalled the cat. "Meow." And the giant's wife cried, "Leave off, man, it's me, man. Oh, man, leave off, it's me. Arr, 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 arr. Meow, meow, leave off, man." But at first he couldn't hear her voice. Amid the noise and confusion, Molly crept softly out from behind the door. The giant saw her, roared, and ran after her. And Molly ran, and the giant ran, and they both ran. And she ran, and he ran, and she ran, and he ran, and she ran, and he ran, till they came to the bridge of the single hair. And Molly skipped along over it. But the giant stayed, for he couldn't so much as put a foot on it. And he cried out after her in a dreadful voice across the chasm, "Woe betide ye, Molly Whuppie, if you e'er return again." Molly waved her hand at the giant over the chasm and flung back her head. "Never again I'll come and see, for I'll come no more to Spain." Then Molly ran off back to the king's house with the giant's ring in her pocket, and she was married to the king's youngest son. And there was the finest feast the country had ever seen, and there were guests by the hundred from every part of the country who ate until they could eat no more. But the giant never so much as gnawed a dry bone.